The hardest part about losing someone is not the funeral. It is the day life dares to look ordinary again, because that is when impossible things have room to happen. My name is Margaret Hayes, and 6 months after I buried my husband, Daniel, I believed I had finally learned how to survive without him. I was 66 years old, living alone in the small Ohio home we had shared for more than 40 years. Every morning followed the same quiet routine. I watered the flowers Daniel had planted beside the front porch. I fed the pair of bluebirds that always landed on our fence. Then I drove 12 miles to the Saturday farmer's market, buying only enough fresh vegetables and bread for one person instead of two. Even after half a year, reaching for a second loaf of bread still felt natural before I reminded myself that I no longer needed it. Grief has a strange way of hiding inside the smallest habits. Daniel had been the kind of man everyone trusted. He repaired neighbors' fences without accepting payment. He coached Little League long after our own daughter, Grace, had grown up. He remembered birthdays better than anyone I had ever met. When he became seriously ill, our entire community stood beside us. His memorial service filled the church beyond capacity. Friends, coworkers, old classmates, and even people I had never met came to tell me how much he had meant to them. I remember standing beside his casket thinking that if love alone could save someone, Daniel would have lived forever. During the months that followed, Grace called every evening to make sure I had eaten dinner. My neighbor, Linda Foster, stopped by every Tuesday with homemade soup whether I needed it or not. They were kind people, but eventually everyone returned to their own lives, as they should have. I tried to do the same. I volunteered twice a week at the public library. I attended church every Sunday. I even joined a gardening club because Daniel always said I spent too much time indoors. Little by little, I convinced myself that healing did not mean forgetting. It simply meant carrying love differently. That Saturday morning looked no different from any other. The market buzzed with familiar sounds. Children laughed near the apple stand. Local musicians played soft country songs beside the bakery. Vendors greeted regular customers by name. I purchased fresh tomatoes, sweet corn, and a small bouquet of yellow daisies because they had always been Daniel's favorite flowers. I was waiting in line at a honey stand when someone walked past me carrying a canvas grocery bag. I noticed the jacket first. Brown canvas with slightly worn elbows. Daniel had owned one almost exactly like it. My heart tightened, but I told myself not to be foolish. Thousands of men owned jackets like that. Then the stranger reached into his pocket for his wallet. The movement stopped my breath. He rubbed the back of his neck exactly the way Daniel always had whenever he searched for something. My eyes slowly lifted toward his face. Every sound around me disappeared. The shape of his jaw, the silver hair above his ears, the gentle curve of his smile as he thanked the vendor. Even the small crease beside his left eye looked identical. I stood frozen with my grocery basket hanging from one hand while the world continued moving without me. My mind searched desperately for a reasonable explanation, but none came. I had stood beside Daniel's hospital bed. I had held his hand during his final hours. I had attended his funeral. I had watched his casket lowered into the ground. I knew what I had lived through. Yet the man standing less than 30 feet away looked so completely like my husband that my knees nearly gave out beneath me. Before I could gather enough courage to call his name, he turned, picked up his grocery bag, and calmly walked toward the parking lot. Something inside me refused to let that moment disappear. I set my basket on the nearest table without another thought, and quietly began following him. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear the traffic beyond the parking lot. Every logical thought told me to stop. I had attended Daniel's funeral. I had signed paperwork, accepted condolences, and spent 6 long months learning how to live with an empty chair across the dinner table. There had to be another explanation. Yet my feet refused to listen to reason. The stranger walked at an unhurried pace across the farmer's market parking lot, carrying his groceries exactly the way Daniel always had, balancing the heavier bag in his left hand while keeping his right hand free. Even his posture felt familiar. I stayed several car lengths behind him, careful not to attract attention. When he reached a dark blue pickup truck, he carefully placed the grocery bags inside before climbing behind the wheel. I remained standing beside my own car, my hands trembling so badly that I nearly dropped my keys. Part of me wanted to drive home and convince myself I had imagined everything. Another part of me knew I would never forgive myself if I let this moment disappear unanswered. As the truck slowly exited the parking lot, I started my engine and followed at a comfortable distance. The drive took us through quiet suburban streets before continuing toward an older neighborhood on the north side of town that I had rarely visited. Along the way, I kept reminding myself that people can resemble one another in extraordinary ways. Perhaps grief had simply made my mind desperate to find Daniel everywhere I looked. But each time the driver checked his mirrors or adjusted one hand on the steering wheel, another familiar habit emerged. Daniel had always tapped the steering wheel twice whenever he stopped at a red light. The man ahead of me did exactly the same thing. By then my hands had grown cold despite the warm afternoon. Nearly 20 minutes later, the truck turned into a peaceful neighborhood lined with mature oak trees and modest brick homes. It finally stopped in the driveway of a white single-story house with blue shutters and a neatly trimmed front lawn. I parked half a block away, hoping not to be noticed. From where I sat, I watched the stranger carry his groceries toward the front porch. Before he reached the door, it opened from inside. An elderly woman with silver hair greeted him with a warm smile. She accepted one of the grocery bags before gently touching his shoulder in a way that suggested years of familiarity rather than a casual friendship. Moments later, another older gentleman appeared behind her, laughing about something I could not hear. The stranger smiled back with the same gentle expression that had once welcomed me home every evening. My chest tightened with confusion. If this really were Daniel, nothing made sense. If it was not Daniel, how could someone share so many details that even the smallest gestures felt identical? I remained inside my car for nearly 15 minutes, watching ordinary family life unfold through the front windows. The elderly couple set groceries on the kitchen counter while the man moved comfortably through the house as though he belonged there. Then something caught my attention. A large framed photograph stood on a bookshelf near the living room window. Even from the distance, I could tell it showed a much younger version of the same man standing beside the elderly couple many years earlier. Whatever story existed here clearly stretched back decades. This was not someone pretending to be another person. This family had known him for a very long time. My phone suddenly rang, startling me. It was my daughter, Grace. I hesitated before answering. "Mom," she said cheerfully. "How was the farmer's market?" I looked back toward the unfamiliar house, unable to take my eyes away. "Grace," I whispered, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I need you to promise you will not think I have completely lost my mind." Silence filled the line for a moment. "What happened?" she asked gently. I took a slow breath before answering. "I think I just spent the last 20 minutes following a man who looks exactly like your father, and he is living in a house where everyone acts as though they have known him their entire lives." Grace remained silent for several seconds before speaking in the calm voice she had inherited from her father. "Mom," she said gently, "stay where you are. I am coming to meet you." I wanted to tell her not to bother, that I had probably allowed grief to play tricks on my mind, but the words would not come. My eyes remained fixed on the quiet white house at the end of the street. Through the front window, I could still see the stranger moving naturally through the living room, helping the elderly couple unpack groceries as though he had done it 1,000 times before. Nothing about the scene suggested deception. It looked like an ordinary family enjoying an ordinary Saturday afternoon. 30 minutes later, Grace pulled her car alongside mine. She climbed into the passenger seat without saying a word, then followed my gaze toward the house. "Which one is he?" she asked softly. Just then the front door opened again. The man stepped outside carrying a watering can and began carefully watering flower beds lining the front walkway. Grace stared through the windshield without blinking. I watched every emotion cross her face one after another. Curiosity, confusion, disbelief. Finally she whispered, "Mom, he looks exactly like Dad." Hearing those words from someone else made the moment feel even more unreal. I had been afraid my own sorrow had distorted reality, but Grace had reached the same conclusion within seconds. We sat quietly, studying every familiar movement. The stranger bent down to remove a few weeds beside a rose bush. He stood up slowly, rubbed the back of his neck with his right hand, and smiled toward the elderly woman watching him from the porch. Grace quietly shook her head. "He even smiles the same way." Neither of us suggested walking to the front door. Something held us back. It was not fear exactly. It was respect for the possibility that we did not yet understand what we were seeing. If this man had lived in that house for years, arriving unannounced with impossible questions could turn innocent lives upside down. We needed answers before we created more confusion. As we continued watching, Grace suddenly pointed toward the mailbox near the curb. "Mom, can you read the name?" I narrowed my eyes, but the letters were too small from where we sat. Grace reached into her purse, removed a small pair of compact binoculars she normally kept for bird watching, and carefully focused on the mailbox. A few moments later, she lowered them with a puzzled expression. "The last name is Carter," she said. "That does not help." She handed me the binoculars. I focused on the front porch instead. Hanging beside the door was a framed family photograph taken many years earlier. Although I could not make out every detail, I could clearly see the same familiar face, only much younger, standing beside the elderly couple. The photograph looked decades old. That single image changed everything. If someone had wanted to pretend to be Daniel, they could never have created a family history stretching back 40 or 50 years. Whatever truth existed had begun long before I met my husband. Grace leaned back in her seat and thought quietly for several moments before speaking again. "Mom, remember when Grandma used to say Dad hardly knew anything about his early childhood because he was adopted by his aunt after his parents died?" I slowly turned toward her. I had not thought about that conversation in years. Daniel rarely discussed his childhood. He always said there were very few records left, and that most of the older relatives who knew the story had passed away before he became an adult. Grace continued carefully. What if there was something nobody in the family ever knew? My heart skipped a beat. The idea sounded impossible, yet somehow it felt more believable than every other explanation we had considered. I looked back toward the house once more. At that exact moment, the stranger disappeared inside, leaving the front door open just long enough for me to catch another glimpse of the hallway wall. Several framed black and white photographs hung there, and one of them appeared to show two identical little boys standing side by side. Neither Grace nor I slept much that night. The image of those two identical little boys remained fixed in my mind long after I returned home. I kept replaying every memory Daniel had ever shared about his childhood, searching for details I might have overlooked. The truth was painfully simple. He had rarely spoken about those years at all. Whenever I asked about his early life, he smiled politely and changed the subject. He always explained that he remembered very little before the age of 6, and that the aunt who raised him had passed away before he was old enough to ask difficult questions. At the time, I accepted that explanation without hesitation because it never seemed unusual. Now, every forgotten conversation suddenly carried new meaning. Early the next morning, Grace arrived with a cardboard storage box she had collected from my attic. Inside were family albums, old insurance papers, handwritten letters, and every document we had kept during 43 years of marriage. We carefully spread everything across my dining room table. Hours passed as we sorted through faded photographs and yellowed envelopes. Most of them showed ordinary milestones: birthdays, Christmas mornings, family vacations, Grace graduating from college. None of them answered the question that had suddenly taken over our lives. Just before lunchtime, Grace discovered a small envelope tucked inside Daniel's high school yearbook. It contained several fragile papers folded neatly together. One was a copy of his delayed birth certificate issued decades after his actual birth. Another was a letter from a county records office explaining that portions of his original birth documentation could not be located because of incomplete adoption files created many years earlier. I stared at the letter for a long time. I had never seen it before. Daniel must have received it long before we were married and quietly stored it away without mentioning it again. Grace continued reading every line carefully. Near the bottom, she suddenly stopped. "Mom," she whispered, sliding the paper toward me. One sentence had been underlined in faded blue ink. It stated that additional family information might exist within sealed hospital archives if surviving biological relatives could ever be identified. We looked at each other without speaking. That single sentence felt like the first real piece of evidence we had found. Grace immediately opened her laptop and began searching public genealogy databases while I continued examining the remaining papers. Within an hour, she found an old newspaper article describing a small county hospital that had permanently closed nearly 50 years earlier. The article explained that many birth records from the hospital had eventually been transferred to the state archives after years of disorganized storage. If Dad was born there, Grace said thoughtfully, those records might still exist. Hope slowly replaced confusion. For the first time since seeing the stranger, We had a direction instead of endless questions. Grace called the state archives before they closed for the day. After patiently explaining our situation, she spoke with a records specialist who listened more carefully than we expected. The woman explained that adoption records remain protected by privacy laws, but non-identifying historical documents could sometimes be reviewed through a formal request if enough information was available. She suggested beginning with hospital admission logs and maternity records from the week Daniel had been born. We completed the necessary request forms that same afternoon. Before ending the call, the records specialist asked one final question. Do you have any reason to believe there may have been another infant connected to the same birth? Grace and I exchanged startled glances. Neither of us had mentioned our growing suspicion about identical brothers. Why do you ask? Grace replied carefully. The woman hesitated before answering. Because during that period the hospital handled several unusual family placement cases involving multiple births. I cannot discuss individual files without authorization, but I recommend requesting every available document from that week rather than limiting your search to one child. After the call ended, neither of us spoke for several moments. My eyes drifted toward the framed wedding photograph resting on the bookshelf across the room. Daniel smiled back at me with the same gentle expression I had loved for decades. I quietly whispered that if there was a truth he had never been given the chance to know, I intended to uncover it now, no matter how many years had already passed. The next 2 weeks felt longer than the previous 6 months. Every afternoon, I checked the mailbox with the same mixture of hope and anxiety, wondering whether the state archives had found anything that could explain the mystery that had quietly entered our lives. I tried returning to my normal routine. I volunteered at the library, attended Sunday service, and even joined Linda Foster for coffee one morning, but my thoughts always drifted back to the stranger with Daniel's face. Linda noticed the distraction immediately. After listening carefully to everything Grace and I had discovered, she remained unusually thoughtful before speaking. You know, she said slowly, I remember your husband mentioning an old family friend named Eleanor Matthews. She used to visit his aunt when he was very young. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I could not remember ever meeting her. Linda explained that Eleanor had worked as a nurse decades ago and had remained close to Daniel's adoptive family until moving to another county after retirement. She has to be well into her 80s now, Linda added. But last I heard she was still living in a small assisted living community about 30 miles away. Grace and I looked at one another. We had promised ourselves not to jump to conclusions, yet every new piece of information seemed to point toward a forgotten chapter of Daniel's childhood. 2 days later, we drove to the retirement community and asked whether Eleanor Matthews was accepting visitors. A kind receptionist explained that Eleanor enjoyed meeting guests as long as they were respectful and patient because her memory occasionally wandered. When we entered her sunny sitting room, an elderly woman with bright blue eyes welcomed us warmly. She smiled politely until Grace placed one of Daniel's old photographs on the table. Eleanor's expression changed instantly. She reached toward the picture with trembling fingers before quietly whispering, "Little Danny." Hearing those words sent a chill through my entire body. I gently introduced myself and explained that I had been Daniel's wife. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, clearly overwhelmed by memories she had not visited in many years. "He was such a gentle little boy," she said softly, always asking questions that nobody wanted to answer. I carefully asked whether Daniel had ever spoken about having brothers or sisters. Eleanor remained silent for several moments before looking toward the window. "There were many things families tried to hide back then," she answered carefully. "Hospitals were different. Records were different. Sometimes adults believed children would be happier if difficult truths disappeared." Grace leaned forward without interrupting. Eleanor looked at Daniel's photograph once again before continuing. "I promised I would never discuss private matters that were not mine to tell. Most of the people involved are gone now, but promises are difficult to break." Although she refused to reveal specific details, one sentence stood out above everything else she said. "Your husband spent his whole life believing his story began after he was adopted, but that was never where his story truly started." Those words stayed with us during the drive home. Eleanor had not confirmed our growing suspicion, yet she had not dismissed it either. 3 days later, an official envelope from the state archives finally arrived. My hands trembled as Grace carefully opened it on the kitchen table. Inside were copies of hospital admission records, maternity logs, and a letter explaining that additional historical documents had been located during the search. Most of the paperwork consisted of faded handwritten entries that were difficult to read. Then Grace suddenly stopped turning pages. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Near the bottom of one hospital ledger, beside the date of Daniel's birth, appeared a notation that had been overlooked for decades. The line listed one mother, one delivery, and then two male infants admitted only minutes apart before several portions of the record disappeared beneath heavy black archival markings that protected confidential information. Neither of us spoke. We simply stared at the page while trying to understand what it meant. For the first time, we held something created on the very day Daniel entered the world, and it suggested that the impossible possibility we had been chasing might not have been impossible at all. Grace carefully placed the copied hospital record back into its envelope as though it were made of glass. Neither of us wanted to speak first because saying the words aloud would make the possibility feel real. Two male infants. One delivery. One date that matched Daniel's birthday exactly. The information did not prove anything by itself, but it was enough to convince us that we could no longer ignore what had once seemed impossible. The following morning, Grace contacted the records specialist again and explained what we had found. The woman listened patiently before recommending that we consult a retired investigator who occasionally assisted families with complicated historical adoption cases. His name was Samuel Brooks, and although he had spent more than 30 years working in family records and missing relative investigations, he now accepted only a few cases each year. Grace arranged an appointment for the following Tuesday. Samuel Brooks welcomed us into a modest office lined with shelves filled with old county maps, genealogy books, and carefully labeled archival boxes. He appeared thoughtful rather than dramatic, the kind of man who preferred evidence over speculation. After reviewing every document we had collected, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "You have already done more careful research than many people manage in months," he said. "The important thing now is to avoid making assumptions before the remaining evidence is collected." I appreciated his honesty. During the past several weeks, my emotions had carried me from impossible hope to cautious optimism so many times that I no longer trusted my own expectations. Samuel studied the hospital ledger once more before pointing toward the heavily blacked-out section. "Those redactions tell me something valuable," he explained. "If the information had no legal or historical significance, there would have been nothing to protect. That means additional records almost certainly still exist." Grace asked whether those records could identify the second child. Samuel nodded slowly. "Possibly. Privacy laws remain important, but when both individuals are deceased or when extraordinary family circumstances exist, limited access can sometimes be approved." Before leaving his office, Samuel asked us one unexpected question. "Do you still know where the man from the farmer's market lives?" I hesitated before giving him the address. He wrote it down without comment. "Please do not contact him yet," he advised. "If your theory is correct, he has spent an entire lifetime believing his own version of family history. Discoveries like this deserve preparation, not surprises." His words felt wise. As difficult as waiting had become, I knew he was right. 2 days later, Samuel called with the first significant update. He had located an archived newspaper announcement from the week Daniel was born. The local hospital had briefly reported the arrival of healthy twin boys to a young married couple before issuing a correction several days later that mentioned only one surviving infant without explaining the change. Samuel believed the correction itself was unusual because hospitals rarely published follow-up notices unless official records had been amended. My heart raced as he continued. "There is one more thing," he said. The family name listed in the original announcement was not Hayes. It was Carter. Grace and I looked at one another in stunned silence. Carter. The same name we had seen on the mailbox outside the White House. Samuel explained that the elderly couple living there had raised a son named Thomas Carter for decades. Public records showed he had never moved away from the area, had worked as a high school history teacher before retiring, and had no criminal history or evidence of fraud. Everything about his life appeared completely ordinary. That ordinary life somehow made the mystery even more extraordinary. I thanked Samuel before ending the call and walked quietly to my living room. On the mantel rested the framed photograph from our 40th wedding anniversary. I smiled sadly at Daniel's familiar face. If Thomas Carter truly shared your beginning, I thought, then neither of you ever knew the other existed. Just as I turned away from the photograph, my telephone rang once again. It was Samuel. His normally steady voice carried a note of quiet urgency. "Margaret," he said, "the court has agreed to release one sealed document tomorrow morning, and I believe it may finally explain why two brothers spent nearly 7 decades living separate lives without ever knowing the truth." The following morning, Grace and I met Samuel Brooks outside the county courthouse just after 9:00. The autumn air felt cool against my face, but it did nothing to calm the nervous anticipation building inside me. Samuel carried a thin sealed envelope that had arrived only minutes earlier from the archives department. Before opening it, he looked at both of us with quiet seriousness. "Whatever we find inside," he said, "remember that the people involved made decisions under circumstances we still do not fully understand." I nodded, although I was no longer certain what I expected to learn. Samuel carefully unfolded several aging documents and began reading. The first page confirmed that twin boys had been born on the same day at the same hospital. The second contained handwritten notes from a social worker assigned to the family after unexpected medical complications affected both parents. According to the report, a series of administrative mistakes, combined with emergency placements and incomplete communication between agencies, resulted in the brothers entering different family care arrangements during their first weeks of life. By the time officials recognized the error, separate legal proceedings had already begun. Records showed that one child eventually became Daniel Hayes, while the other was adopted by the Carter family and named Thomas Carter. I closed my eyes as the truth settled over me. Daniel had lived nearly 70 years without ever knowing that his identical twin brother existed only a few miles away. Grace quietly wiped away tears before asking the question that had been haunting both of us. "Does Thomas know any of this?" Samuel gently shook his head. "Based on everything I have reviewed, he grew up believing he was an only child. There is no evidence that either family understood the complete situation. The mystery that had once felt impossible suddenly became heartbreakingly human. There had been no elaborate deception, no hidden second life, and no betrayal. Only a tragic chain of bureaucratic mistakes that quietly separated two brothers before either of them was old enough to remember." Samuel waited a moment before speaking again. "The decision about contacting Thomas belongs entirely to your family. I would recommend honesty, patience, and compassion. His life may change today, just as dramatically as yours already has." Grace reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "Mom," she whispered, "Dad would have wanted the truth to matter." Those words stayed with me throughout the drive to the quiet neighborhood where everything had begun. This time I did not park half a block away. I walked slowly toward the familiar white house, while Grace remained beside me. Every step felt heavier than the last. I was not walking toward my husband. I was walking toward the only brother he never had the chance to know. Before I could lose my courage, I rang the front doorbell. A few moments later, the door opened. Thomas Carter stood before us wearing the same gentle expression that had first stopped my heart at the farmer's market. Up close, the resemblance was even more astonishing. The same thoughtful eyes, the same calm smile, the same silver hair touched by time. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Finally, Thomas smiled politely and said, "Good afternoon. I believe I have seen you somewhere before." I felt my throat tighten. "You have?" I answered softly. "I saw you at the farmer's market a few weeks ago." He nodded with faint recognition. "I thought you looked familiar." I carefully held out the framed photograph I had carried from home. It showed Daniel and me on our 40th wedding anniversary. Thomas looked down at the picture. The color slowly drained from his face. His eyes moved from the photograph to my face and then back again several times. "Who is this man?" he asked quietly, although I sensed part of him already knew the answer. I took a slow breath before speaking the words that had waited nearly 70 years to be heard. His name was Daniel Hayes. He was my husband, and according to the records we finally uncovered yesterday, he was also your identical twin brother. Thomas never looked away from the photograph. His hands trembled slightly as he continued staring into the face of the man he had somehow known his entire life without ever meeting. Thomas remained completely still, holding the framed photograph with both hands as though it might disappear if he loosened his grip. Several long moments passed before he quietly invited Grace and me inside. The elderly couple I had seen through the window weeks earlier introduced themselves as Richard and Helen Carter. The warmth in their eyes immediately told me they had no idea that a hidden chapter of their son's life had been waiting just beyond their front door for nearly 70 years. We gathered around the dining room table while Thomas carefully listened as Samuel Brooks arrived with copies of the court documents and hospital records. Nobody interrupted as Samuel explained the timeline one careful detail at a time. The twins had been born healthy, but a series of emergencies involving their biological parents created confusion among several agencies responsible for temporary placement. Separate legal proceedings moved forward before anyone realized the brothers had been assigned different identities. By the time officials discovered the mistake, both children had already formed permanent family bonds, and the truth quietly disappeared into sealed records. When Samuel finished speaking, silence settled across the room. Richard Carter slowly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. "We loved Thomas from the first day we held him," he said softly. "If we had known another little boy belonged with him, we would have searched until we found him." Helen reached across the table and gently covered my hand with hers. "Please believe that no one ever hid this from us." I squeezed her hand in return. "I do believe you," I answered honestly. "Daniel never knew either." Thomas looked down at the wedding photograph again before asking the question I had feared most. What kind of man was my brother? Tears filled my eyes, but this time they carried gratitude instead of confusion. I smiled through them as I began describing the life Daniel had lived. I told Thomas about the Little League teams Daniel coached every spring, about the neighbors whose broken fences he quietly repaired without accepting money, about the Christmas mornings when he woke before sunrise because he was always more excited than Grace. I described our 43 years of marriage, the camping trips, the family vacations, the evenings spent dancing in our kitchen while dinner cooked on the stove. Grace added stories from her childhood, laughing through tears as she remembered her father teaching her to ride a bicycle and patiently helping with every school science project. Thomas listened without looking away, smiling whenever another piece of Daniel's personality sounded strangely familiar. Finally, he laughed softly and admitted, "I still wake up before sunrise every Christmas morning, and I have been volunteering at the local high school for years because I enjoy helping young people learn." The similarities no longer felt mysterious. They felt deeply human. Before leaving that afternoon, Thomas disappeared into another room and returned carrying several old family albums. Together, we compared photographs spanning nearly 7 decades. In one album, Daniel smiled beside me at our anniversary celebration. In another, Thomas stood with Richard and Helen at his retirement party. The resemblance was astonishing, yet the differences told 2 completely separate life stories shaped by 2 loving families who had never known each other existed. Grace quietly placed the albums side by side across the table. "Dad missed having a brother," she whispered. "He just never realized it." Thomas nodded slowly before reaching into one of the albums. He removed a faded childhood photograph showing himself at about 6 years old holding a toy airplane. "I used to wonder why I always felt like someone was missing from pictures I could not even remember," he admitted. None of us knew how to answer because some questions belonged more to the heart than to history. As Grace and I prepared to leave, Thomas walked us to the front porch. The afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the quiet neighborhood where this unbelievable journey had begun. Before saying goodbye, Thomas looked at me with gentle sincerity. "I cannot meet my brother," he said quietly. "But because you came looking for answers instead of walking away, I finally know that he existed, and somehow that changes everything." Life has a remarkable way of changing what we believe closure looks like. 6 months earlier, I thought saying goodbye meant standing beside Daniel's grave with flowers in my hands and tears in my eyes. Now I understood that goodbye was never a single moment. Sometimes it continued unfolding long after the funeral had ended, revealing pieces of a story that no one had known existed. During the months that followed, Thomas became a quiet but meaningful part of our family. Grace invited him to Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, and birthdays that once felt incomplete after Daniel's passing. Every visit uncovered another small coincidence that made us smile. Thomas preferred his coffee exactly the way Daniel had. Both men loved old country songs, repaired broken furniture instead of replacing it, and could never resist stopping to help a stranger with a flat tire. They had grown into different men shaped by different families. Yet certain qualities seemed to have traveled with them from the very beginning. Richard and Helen Carter also became dear friends. There was never anger between our families because none of us had created the circumstances that separated two brothers before they were old enough to remember each other. Instead, we shared something far more valuable. We shared the chance to honor both lives with honesty instead of regret. One crisp October afternoon, Thomas asked whether he could visit Daniel's resting place. Grace and I gladly agreed. We drove together to the quiet cemetery where golden leaves drifted gently across the grass. Thomas stood silently before the headstone for several minutes, reading every word carved into the granite. He placed a small bouquet of yellow dais beside the grave after I quietly mentioned they had always been Daniel's favorite flowers. Then he smiled through tears and said, "I wish we could have argued about baseball scores, complained about getting older, and embarrassed our grandchildren together." I laughed softly because I knew Daniel would have enjoyed every one of those conversations. Before leaving, Thomas rested one hand against the headstone and whispered, "I am sorry we never found each other, brother." The words were simple, but they carried nearly 70 years of silence. As we walked back toward the car, I no longer felt the sharp ache that had followed me since Daniel's passing. In its place was a quieter feeling, one that blended sadness with gratitude. The mystery that began at the farmer's market had not returned my husband to me. Instead, it had given me the final chapter of his story, a chapter neither of us ever knew existed. Several weeks later, I sat alone on my front porch watching bluebirds gather along the fence Daniel had built years earlier. The evening breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves through the garden. I looked toward the empty chair beside mine, but for the first time it did not seem quite so empty. I thought about the impossible moment when I believed I had seen my husband walking through a crowded market. If I had dismissed it as imagination, if I had turned away instead of asking questions, an entire family history would have remained hidden forever. That experience taught me something I will carry for the rest of my life. Sometimes the answers we fear most become the ones that bring the deepest peace. Love does not always leave us the way we expect. Sometimes it waits patiently inside forgotten records, old photographs, and strangers who are not strangers at all. Whenever people ask how I found the strength to keep searching, I simply smile and tell them the truth. I never followed a ghost. I followed hope. And hope led me not back to the man I lost, but to the family he never knew he had, allowing all of us to close a circle that had remained broken for almost 70 years. In the end, I realized that although death had ended Daniel's life, it had not ended the love, kindness, or connections he left behind. Those continued growing in ways none of us could have imagined, reminding me every single day that the most extraordinary discoveries sometimes begin with one ordinary decision to keep walking instead of looking away.